You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast produced by Veteran Strategies and featuring conversations with fascinating and impactful men and women who have shaped our world, our communities, and our history. My name is Robert Vane, Principal of Veteran Strategies, and your host for our discussion. You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and NFP, a national insurance broker with strong local content. Our podcast is featured on the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact Chris Spangle or me at leadersandlegends.net. And as always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Thank you for joining us on the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest today is award-winning author, educator, military historian, Josiah Bunting III. He is a graduate of the Virginia Military Institute, a former Rhodes Scholar at the University of Oxford, served as a major in the United States Army, and as superintendent of the famed Virginia Military Institute. He has published several books, received many honors, and today on the Leaders and Legends podcast, we are discussing his new book, The Making of a Leader, The Formative Years of George C. Marshall. Mr. Bunting, thank you very much for coming on the podcast. It's truly an honor.
Pleasure for me. Thank you.
You have done so much writing and your academic career is so varied. What made you decide at this point to take on the early years of General of the Army, George C. Marshall?
The school I went to, the Virginia Military Institute, was Marshall's alma mater. And by the time I got there, Marshall had become the well-known George Marshall, winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, Secretary of State. He was a hero for all of us. And to use a current phrase, at least when I was there, something of a role model. He had been a cadet at VMI, and every time he received a promotion in the Army, eventually becoming a five-star general, they mentioned his alma mater, so we were very proud of him.
Is it fair to say that George Marshall was just perhaps the most famous 20th century graduate of a very productive and patriotic institution?
I could not put it better myself. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you. The Virginia Military Institute is famous. And really, if you've studied, especially Civil War history, you realize how much VMI contributed to that conflict. George Marshall there was a very good book an excellent book, actually, written a few decades ago. And it was by author named Thomas Connolly. And it was called The Marble Man. And it was about Robert E. Lee. It was one of the first sort of counter hagiographic histories of Lee. Mm-hmm. Would it be fair to call in any way Marshall a marble man?
Yes, it would be fair to call him that if the term were being applied as a term of admiration. But I think it makes him sound a bit more, I don't want to say anything like a stuffed shirt, but I think it makes him sound a little bit less accessible than he really was. He was a very normal person.
He does seem, we're going to talk about how he became the not so marble man, but he, especially in movie portrayals, and I've read a lot, I have not read the David Rohl biography of Marshall, even though I did just interview Mr. Rohl for his new book about Roosevelt and Truman, which is superb. But he comes across, whether movies or books, as someone who just seems so stoic and intimidating. Would those be two words you would use? And if not, which words would you use to describe General Marshall?
I would use those words, yes, but my use of the words in a sentence would end with a semicolon, and I would go on to say that Marshall came across as a very formidable person, even an intimidating person, a very functional person in a conversation, very difficult to get off the subject for which you had asked for an interview, and yet a man of great humanity and very accessible once you got to know him. But the exterior was quite formidable. And, I think
Did
that.
he? Go ahead,
Excuse,
sir. No,
no,
you go ahead.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Did he have relationships other than with his wives? Did he have relationships that where he let his guard down a little bit? I thought I had read a story or read a part of a book where he seemed to have this interesting relationship with Patton, where he called him Georgie. Am I remembering that correct?
I think you are remembering it, but there would be an inflection of irony and good humor in the back of his throat when he called him Georgie. Senior generals in the Army, Patton's generation, to use the cliche phrase, looked up to Marshall as a kind of a stoic, imperturbable, almost inaccessible person. They admired him greatly, but he was not somebody to trifle with, even in conversation.
And how much of that do you think was his natural personality? Maybe 100%. And how much of that do you think was his personality matching his rank and responsibilities?
I think it was his natural personality. I don't think Marshall was ever conscious of adapting personality or changing any aspect of his character. He was who he was, and I don't think he thought unduly about that. He was just, that was the way he was. He was, to use a very common word in descriptions of him, extremely formidable. Always courteous, always solicitous of the conversationalist with whom he talked. But he was a formidable person, not scary, but formidable.
It would have been maybe entertaining isn't the right word, but
No.
to sit in on a few of the discussions between Fleet Admiral Ernest King and General of the Army George Marshall.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, not a lot of humor back and forth there.
Let's talk a little bit about Marshall's family. You detail it in the book. They were Kentuckians in some way, although I think, is it right? He was born in Pennsylvania, but they had true Virginia roots.
That's right.
A fair way to say it. Go ahead, sir.
That's exactly right. And he went to school at the Virginia Military Institute, sometimes called the West Point of the South, and was always an alumnus of whom the Institute was very proud. And he watered his roots there constantly. Very, very proud to have gone there.
Now, Marshall was born in the 1880s. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah.
So he's not of the Civil War generation, but his immediate ancestors and forebears were. How did that war and the memory of that war, especially as a Southern lad coming from a mostly Southern family, how did that affect Marshall growing up?
I think it affected him in ways that were enormously productive and fortuitous for his career of service in the United States Army. He was a patriot to his fingertips, an American patriot to his fingertips. And although his manners were, as they commonly would say, Virginian, he was a great American. And his patriotism and service in the American Army was the constant beacon in his career.
Would you say that George Marshall decided early in his life that he wanted to be a military man?
I would think so. Yes. Very early in his life. Yeah. Yes.
What do you think influenced that decision? It's interesting how military service runs in families.
Mhm.
And there's some families that, for better or worse, have no real tradition.
Mhm.
In my family, in 4 generations, we've had 17 veterans,
Mhm.
including my son, Joshua, who did 2 tours in Afghanistan as an 11 Bravo. God love him.
God love
And
him.
yeah, God love him. It was a
Returned
wonderful.
home safely.
He did. He returned home after his second tour. He had some injuries over there that weren't necessarily that became worse, and so he's on 100% disability. His mother was a veteran, I think, of the Gulf War. I was in from 87 to 90. My mother was in the Marine Corps. My dad was in the Marine Corps. The list goes on. But there are families that are just so strong with the military. Was that true of Marshall's family? Because his brother went to VMI.
But yes, it was true. There was a history there, but I would not say it was a profound and continuous history. Some served in the military, but not necessarily a strong military tradition throughout the family history. He grew up in Pennsylvania, in southwest Pennsylvania, went to the Virginia Military Institute and had a very strong career there, and then into the Army. And into the Army at a fortuitous time for him, because we were just getting ready to fight in World War One. So his career furnished many opportunities for him to demonstrate the qualities of leadership and I would call military circumspection, military talent that he had. And right from the get-go, he demonstrated great promise.
You are listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. It's an appropriate name for this particular episode, as we are speaking with award-winning and truly revered, and I'm going to say that word, author and historian Josiah Bunting III. We are discussing his new book, The Making of a Leader, The Formative Years of George C. Marshall. I read it. It's really more than a biography in some ways. It's almost, I hate to say it's not a self-help book, but it certainly teaches you more than just what's on the worded, it's the words on the page. And if you don't take my word for it, how about this? A beautifully written and analytical biography by a distinguished biographer, soldier, and scholar. That was Victor Davis Hanson's review of this book. And Victor Davis Hanson is the author of my all-time favorite book, The Second World Wars. It's brilliant. And to have praise from someone like that, Mr. Bunting, how does that make you feel about your effort and the work you put into this?
Made me feel wonderful because, like you, I'm a great admirer of Victor Davis Hanson. I've read all of his books, and really, he's about as good as it gets in our generation of military historians.
Absolutely. Especially as a classicist.
That's right.
My graduate degree is in medieval history, and I've always said yes, sir. I wrote a thesis on a fellow named Sir Thomas Erpingham, who was commander of the archers at Agincourt.
My goodness. Where would you do your research on the archers at Agincourt?
at one of the most wonderful libraries in the world, and that's Indiana University.
No kidding.
Yeah. And since then, my thesis was late 20th century, but there's been several books out on Erpingham and that Agincourt campaign by Henry V. And there's a new biography of Henry V coming out, and I'm hoping to have that author, Dan Jones, on the podcast as well.
When I was at VMI, we called him Hank Sank.
One of the great what-ifs of history is the early death of Henry V, which led directly to the Wars of the Roses and all that drama.
When you said early death, how old was he when he died? Hank Sank.
I think early to mid 30s.
Yeah.
Agincourt's 1415, October 25th.
Yep.
The Treaty of Troyes is 22, and he dies like the next year.
Yes.
His kid's only 6 months old, and then I've had several historians of that time period on the podcast. It's just a fascinating era, as is the one that you described. There was a statement, and I'm trying to remember who said it, of Franklin Roosevelt, and I can't remember it at the moment, but it basically went something like he had a third class intellect, but a first class temperament. Mm-hmm. And in reading your book on George Marshall, maybe that applies as well. He doesn't do very well academically, but in all the measurements that involve honesty and character and leadership, he's off the charts.
Yes, I think that's true. And I think we have to be very careful when we impute carelessly popular judgments about Marshall's mind. He was what you would call a serious, reflective thinker, not particularly articulate, and yet he represents an example of character which has bled into intellect and which forms the basis of the best decisions that human beings are capable of making, character and mind together.
He also seems to have, and we'll get into this a little bit later on the podcast, more than his share of moxie.
Moxie? You mean capacity for finding humor in things and acting upon humorous...
Let's just say that it comes out in your book, and then a few other articles I read in preparation for this interview, that he's not afraid to speak up.
That's right. Never afraid to speak up. Right from the start of his career in the military. That's right.
Do you think that indicated that he had confidence in his intellect, in his judgment?
Yes, he did. Not arrogant confidence, but confidence as he went through his career and found that his abilities, such as they were, suited him perfectly to the career he had chosen for himself. He had a vocational feeling for the United States Army of its early 20th century that perfectly suited him to that career.
And without making the argument that there's a qualitative difference between volunteering and being drafted, because that would be insulting to the people who were drafted and served with honor, of course. Do you believe, especially back then, the Army was low pay, had some absolutely terrible postings in the middle of nowhere? Was there a special degree of selflessness that made someone choose a military career back in the early 20th century?
I think that's true, a degree of selflessness, but it was a powerful, in a way, almost priest-like vocation that attracted Marshall to the military. And I think that was possibly the consequence of boyhood history reading and those kinds of things. He had a strong vocational attraction to the Army from a very early age.
Is that what led him to, he had postings, he was in the, back then would have called the Orient, but he was in China, he's in the Philippines, he's in various places. Yet he always seems to be chosen for the various leadership schools and staff schools that the United States Army had during that time. What is it in Marshall that you think other leaders, higher ranked leaders, saw?
They saw in him a sterling vocational obsession with serving to the best limit of his character and ability, a priest-like vocation, you might almost say, in the Army. In other words, he was a highly realistic in his assessments of career and all of that. But his devotion to the Army and to military service and to the American Army and its history and its traditions was very profound right from the start. He went to a school called the Virginia Military Institute, sometimes called the West Point of the South. And at that particular school, of which he was an alumnus, as am I, that vocation was strengthened.
You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmong Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, and the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn. Our guest today is famed historian Josiah Bunting III. We are discussing his book, The Making of a Leader, The Formative Years of George C. Marshall. Let me read another review. No one could be better qualified to write this superb evocation of General George Marshall's early life than Josiah Bunting. A U.S. Army major himself, Bunting was superintendent of Marshall's alma mater, the Virginia Military Institute, and has immersed himself in all the archival sources for this jewel of a book. That review is from Andrew Roberts. I'd love to get a postcard from Andrew Roberts, let alone something like this. That's a terrific review.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
As all military men, especially back then, when you want to rise through the ranks, it becomes important at a certain point, if possible, to serve in combat. The United States declared war on Imperial Germany, I believe, April 6th, 1917. What did that mean for George Marshall?
Marshall was, like any professional soldier with an early vocation, anxious to prove the strength of that vocation by serving, and especially by serving in wartime situations and leading American soldiers. And he felt a vocation that was unignorable. And I think that was the sustaining fuel of a lifelong career. You can call it idealism if you would like to, but I would just call it sheer patriotism.
He served overseas with many other men who became prominent leaders, generals. Mm-hmm. I want to ask you separately about John Pershing, but who were some of the people with whom Marshall served over there, who then 30 years later are leading the United States in World War II?
You mentioned Pershing. Pershing was a profound influence on Marshall, and to use the careless phrase that we use nowadays, certainly something of a role model for him. The purity of his vocation, the absolute professionalism of his making of decisions, unself-regarding, although he had obviously had plenty of good patriotic ambition. But he was, right from the very beginning, he had a priest-like vocation to serve, just like John Pershing.
Other generals of World War II who famously served in the Great War included Douglas MacArthur and George Patton. Did General Marshall's path ever cross theirs?
Indeed. Marshall and Patton served together. And Marshall and MacArthur, although I think by temperament, they were not particularly drawn to one another. They're very different kinds of people. But yes, they were in the Army at the same time and knew about each other and were good to each other's careers.
Marshall saw combat. So not only was he a superb planner and logistics officer, but he also got in the trenches. Please talk a little bit about George Marshall's career as a combat officer.
It was very early in his career, but that experience in the First World War gave him a very endurable sense of the costs of combat to ordinary American civilians who had become soldiers without any intention of becoming career soldiers. But it gave him a almost idealistic admiration for the American GI as we called him in World War II. And that was an enduring feature of Marshall's leadership all the way through his career, including his service as head of the whole Army as Chief of Staff.
Would you bestow upon Marshall the compliment that he was a natural-born leader?
Yes, a natural-born leader. His instincts were to lead, but I think the purity of his vocational leadership was in a wonderful way rather unself-regarding. In other words, it was a pure vocation. What is the best I can do for these people for whom I am responsible? And that sustained him all the way through his service and later on as Secretary of Defense and all of those things that he achieved at the end.
It seemed to me he never lost his common touch, as reserved as he may have been.
Exactly. Very well put. Yes. Never lost the common touch.
What did serving under what's hard here in 2024, we look back at our military leaders and heroes, and quite frankly, it seems, and please correct me, sir, that we don't think about World War I much. Certainly the Great War in the United States doesn't have the impact it does if you go overseas to Europe. But talk for just a second, please. Explain to the Leaders and Legends podcast audience just how colossal, what did Cassius say about Julius Caesar? Why, man, he doth bestride our narrow world like a colossus that was General Pershing.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
He was an immensely respected and admired figure.
Indeed. And I think among Pershing's admirers, Lieutenant Marshall or the young Marshall was certainly in the forefront. And I think he learned a lot by watching General Pershing, although throughout Marshall's career, he gave the impression of the best kind of humility. I am a servitor. I am serving my country. What is the best I can give it? He always communicated that because that was the essence of his character.
How did he serve General Pershing? And I think you have an episode anecdote in your book. We talked a few minutes ago about Marshall not being afraid to speak up. In what capacity did George Marshall serve General Pershing?
He was fairly remote in rank from General Pershing, as you would know, but he got closer to him much later in his career. And in his capacity as an advisor, was always very frank and very forthright with Pershing and with everyone. He always communicated a lack of self-regard in the statements that he made. He was somebody who strived for what you and I would call disinterestedness in his judgment. Mm. And he communicated that to his superiors throughout his life.
And if I remember correct, your book doesn't go this far in the chronology, but General Pershing, I think, lived till 1947, and General Marshall would go out to see him in the veterans home and have conversations and visit. Am I remembering correct?
I think you are, but I don't press me on that because I haven't read much about that aspect of his later life.
We have a few minutes left with author Josiah Bunting III. We are discussing his book, The Making of a Leader, The Formative Years of George C. Marshall. Of all the postings that Marshall experienced, leaving aside World War I, were there any others you think that really made him into the man he was as he led the Army in the 30s and 40s?
I think the variety of his assignments, which kept him in a astonishingly rich admixture of characters, people of different rank, all the way from private to general, kept his humanity in full touch And he always communicated great solicitude for what some historians condescendingly call the ordinary soldier. He was somebody who was essentially without pretension and without self-regard that was communicable the way some other famous generals achieved their reputations. He was known as to use a word you don't hear much anymore, as a disinterested judge of situations and subordinates, and very unself-regarding in his decisions.
And famously told Winston Churchill, cursed at him and said, "No American is going to die on blank beach."
On that goddamn beach. That's right.
I always took that as less of a strategic pronouncement and more of a we're not gonna uselessly and futilely sacrifice American lives.
His relationship with Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt and the other great ones of that era never altered the essential George Marshall. He was very forthright with everyone. And they understood that, and they admired that, and they cherished it.
Is it true that he once admonished President Franklin Roosevelt, who served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy during World War I? Is it true that he once admonished him and said, "Mr. President, please don't refer to the Navy as we and the Army as them"?
Yes, he did. He did. And one imagines when he said that there was a certain inflection of humor in the back of his throat. Yeah.
Looking at his performance, he becomes Chief of Staff, I think September 1st, 39 is and that's the same day that Germany invades Poland to start World War II. When you think about his service as Army Chief of Staff during the entire Second World War, based on your research for this book and your understanding of Marshall's leadership and character, is his performance as Chief of Staff, does it follow the pattern of his life, or are there some surprises there that you wouldn't have predicted based on Marshall's performance before becoming Chief of Staff?
I would have predicted them anyway. He was an extraordinarily acute judge of character, and particularly the kind of judge of character whose essence was a predictive ability. What will such a man do under stress? What is his capacity to lead large numbers of people? In other words, inferring from what you knew of someone's character, how they would be suited to the positions for which you were nominating him. Very acute that way.
The conclusion of your book is titled "A Soldier for Democracy." Why did you choose that as your conclusion title, and how does that fit George C. Marshall?
He, in essence, was the ideal American patriot who was in a lifetime of service to his country. And he understood the various strains and stresses of ambition which motivated people who came into the Army, many of whom did not wish to be in the Army. But he always had great feeling for the average, what we would call the average GI. He was always, in his calculation, able to make good judgments about the average, quote unquote, GI in combat and the quality of his service. He had a great sense of people who came into the Army, especially in wartime, and an undying admiration for them.
Is it fair to say that of all the leaders of this time period, both civilian and military, very few of these men have had their reputations hold up as well as George C. Marshall?
I think that's a very fair statement. Yeah, really. Yes.
We've reached the point in the Leaders and Legends podcast where we ask the same 5 questions of all of our guests. Mr. Bunting, are you ready?
Ready.
I should note also that my niece, Katie Elkins, who retired as a major in the United States Army, also served in Afghanistan. First question, what was your first job?
My first job in the military?
No, just first job.
Gosh. I think the first job that I can remember was as a Marine private at Parris Island.
That's where my mother and father went through basic. It's where they met.
Yeah. That's where I went through basic.
When were you in? When did you go through?
1957.
My parents were there at the exact same time.
Yeah. Went through Parris Island. And I have good memories of it, too.
I guess I should say I don't have any memories of it, but I guess it worked out well for all of us.
I think so.
What was your first concert?
My first concert that I went to?
Mm-hmm.
I think the first one that I remember vividly was at Tanglewood, not too far from Litchfield, Connecticut, Litchfield County, Connecticut, where I grew up. And I remember quite vividly the Tchaikovsky Piano Concerto and the Mendelssohn Italian Symphony. Those are things that I remember.
Beautiful. Number 3, if you could suggest any book for someone to read, which book would you recommend?
The Old Testament of the Bible.
Number 4, if you could witness any event in history, be there in person as it happens, which event would you choose?
Winston Churchill, in his first experience in World War I in combat.
When he went after he resigned as in the Admiralty and went over to the trenches?
Yes.
Last question. If you could have dinner with anyone living today, 2 hours off the record just to chat, whom would you choose?
Anyone today. Gosh. Anyone living today.
Yes, sir.
I want to reserve judgment before I say something that I might regret.
There are no grades.
I want to defer judgment and not answer that question.
You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, and the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn. As always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of World War II veteran P.E. McAllister. Our guest today has been Josiah Bunting III, famed and acclaimed historian and biographer. We discussed his new book, The Making of a Leader, The Formative Years of George C. Marshall. Mr. Bunting, both thank you for writing this book and for coming on the Leaders and Legends podcast.
A great pleasure and a great honor, and I'm grateful to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.